And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and wherever you are in the world, welcome to another ROPE webinar. And this one quite seems to have interested a lot of people, a lot of subscribers, and I welcome you all. Um, I ask you to keep your microphones muted until it's your turn to speak if you have questions, etc. But today's guests, Barry Eichengreen and Matthias Vernengo, they will be introduced by um, our host today. Lilia Costabile is a professor of economics at the University of Naples Federico II and a life member, Clare Hall of Cambridge. She is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, deputy chairman of the European Association for Banking and Financial History. She's a fellow of Academia Pontaniana and a council member of the European Association for the History of Economic Thought. She received her first degree in history and philosophy at the University of Florence and her MPhil and PhD in economics at the University of Cambridge. In 2016, she received the prize of the President of the Italian Republic, awarded by the Accademia dei Lincei for her contributions to economics. She was the first female member of the President's Advisory Council from 1998 to 2001, then the first female deputy chairman from 2004 to 2007 of the Italian Economists Association. She was also the founding scientific director of the Economists Historical Archives. Her research focuses on monetary history and analysis, development economics, and the history of economic thought. Her work has been published in several academic journals. She is the author of a book on Malthus and editor of several other books. Lilia, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me as the host of this important webinar. I think it's very popular because the subject we are dealing with today is very important. It's not just a celebration of what happened 50 years ago and what happened in the interval between 1971 and now, but also important for the future perspectives of the international economy. So I would like to share my screen, but I'm not sure. It's different than usual, of course. Can you see it?
No.
No. Can you see it now? No.
No.
Oh.
So let me just share it.
I did the usual thing, share your screen, but it's completely different from.
Oh, there you go. Yes, we can see.
Okay. 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 So the objective of our meeting today is to take stock of the transformation that happened in the international monetary system in the 50 years since President Nixon kept the knot of the Gordian knot of the dollar convertibility into gold. And from that moment on, he really sent gold into the status of barbarous relics. I would like to say, first of all, who our guest speakers are and introduce them. They are, of course, very well-known authors and very well-known experts in the field of monetary economics and the international monetary system. Barry Eichengreen is the George and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California. He is also associate of the National Bureau of Economics Research and the Center for Economic Policy Research. He has covered several important positions, very prestigious positions, like he has been senior policy advisor at the IMF, convener of the prestigious Bellagio Group, and president of the Economic History Association. He is also, he is perhaps the world leading expert on the international monetary system and international currencies, and also their evolution through time, because he is not only an economist, he is also an economic historian. And if you look at the books, the publications, papers and books that he has published for almost 40 years, you can see that he really specializes in this field. And all the titles are very well known. For instance, Global Imbalances and the Lesson from Bretton Woods, Exorbitant Privilege, How Global Currencies Work, Renminbi Internationalizations, Hall of Mirrors, and recently he has also been writing on inequality, globalization and inequality, which I think is a field of interest to this kind of audience today, and also on populism. And he has also been working on the relationship between the gold standard and the euro. Our next guest speaker is Matthias Vernengo. He is professor at Bucknell University, co-editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics. He has been a senior manager of economic research at the Central Bank of Argentina and external consultant to several United Nations organizations. He is one of the leading exponents of the post-Keynesian School of Economics, and he is also an expert on our subject today, which means he has been writing on hegemonic currencies, capital controls, dollarization, euro imbalances, and also I think it's very relevant what he has been writing about economic development, and in particular on Raoul Prebisch. And he has been publishing widely in Cambridge Journal of Economics, Review of Political Economy, Review of Keynesian Economics, and so on and so forth. Many of the leading journals in the post-Keynesian approach to economics. So before I give them the microphone, the virtual microphone, I would like to talk about some of the questions we will be interested in today. And we can group them under three headings: continuity and change, evaluation, and future perspectives. Concerning the first point, we will ask, and our speakers will explain to us how and how much has the international monetary system changed with the end of Bretton Woods. I know there will be a lot on exchange rates, capital mobility in their presentation, but I would like also to highlight one of the questions that is of interest to me. that is, when did we really move from a gold exchange standards to a dollar standard? Was it in 1971, or did the decoupling between dollar and gold begin well before that date? We know that there is a long tradition of critical economists, from Keynes to Triffin, Harrod, and even Guido Carli, former governor of the Italian, the Bank of Italy, the Italian Central Bank, who talked about convertibility as a fiction. Keynes, who has always been ahead of his time, started to talk of a dollar standard already in the early 20s. And it was followed by a long series of other economists. I will just recall Harrod, who defined the functioning of the international monetary system mostly during the 60s, when there was a lot of external intervention by the US, has inconvertibility through gentleman's agreement. But in fact, on the other hand, one must also say that in the period where Bretton Woods really worked as an international monetary system, that is between 1951 and 1959, sorry, and 1971, the Treasury of the United States sold a lot of gold, and also that in 1965, for the first time, US external liabilities towards monetary authorities and governments in the rest of the world exceeded its world reserve. So in a sense, the problem is not really solved yet. How much convertibility was a fiction, and how much did the gold really constrain either the American monetary policy and the balance of payments, and or the growth in the international economy. So I would like to hear something about this from our speakers. And second, we will talk about evaluation, not necessarily in the sense of a moral evaluation, but we may be able to say something about the advantages and disadvantages of the two systems, Bretton Woods and the post-Bretton Woods, under the following respects: financial stability, frequency of financial crisis, global imbalances, price stability, and power asymmetry. And as far as future perspectives are concerned, we are going to ask ourselves whether the international monetary system is going to settle down in the foreseeable future on a more or less stable configuration. And if so, what are going to be its basic features? Is it going to be a unipolar or multipolar, a symmetric or asymmetric system? And does multipolarity imply symmetry? And of course, that depends on how definition of symmetry. For some people, it means the sharing of the burden of the adjustment between debtor and creditor countries. And this was the case, for instance, with Britain just after the Second World War. But then it became the case with the United States themselves 20 years later. But also, some people mean asymmetry, some people mean the elimination of the exorbitant privilege or the privilege to have the deficit without the tears, as the French used to say. And also, if the system is going to become a multipolar monetary system, will it be stable or more stable or more unstable? Because of there may be sudden shifts in the composition of reserve holdings from one currency to the other. So perhaps we will need, if this happens, if the system will become a multipolar system, then in this case, we may need even more international cooperation than was needed during Bretton Woods. And at this moment, it's quite difficult to imagine international cooperation between the dollar and the renminbi. And also capital mobility. Is it still possible to put some brake or at least some sand in the wheel, that is Tobin-like taxes on international money markets? And can it be the result of policy choices, or the forces of capital mobility are so strong that at the moment it's not possible to do anything about that? And finally, is the old distinction between short-term speculative flows and productive flows still useful? I think it is, because even during the soaring crisis in Europe, we saw that there was a difference between greenfield investments from Germany in the Eastern European countries and speculative investment in southern countries, and this affected these countries' respective ability to react to the crisis itself, to capital mobility and sudden stops in the south of Europe. So I would like to recall you to raise your hand after each presentation if you want to ask a question to Barry. Barry Eichengreen is the first speaker, and he is going to talk about Bretton Woods. So please, Barry, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you. So
I will have to go out of this. Okay.
very good. So I'm especially delighted that Lilia is chairing this session. Among other things, she helps to superintend the most amazing archives of the Banco de Napoli. I had the pleasure of seeing them a few years ago on the sidelines of a conference, and they're quite an amazing resource. I also appreciated that Lilia mentioned the Bellagio group in passing. The Bellagio group is a group that meets annually to discuss reform of the international monetary system, our topic today. And it was established with leadership from Fritz Machlup and later Peter Kennan and Bob Mundell in the 1960s, precisely in order to brainstorm about whether the Bretton Woods system could be saved. And if not, what to do about it. The nature of the group has changed a little bit over the years. I was fortunate enough to chair it from 2001 through 2019. It's a group of academics and high-level central bankers and treasury officials, and I can report that they haven't solved the problem of how to reform the international monetary system quite yet. If I can share my screen. Thanks also to Louis-Philippe, who commissioned the paper for the review of political economy. That's the basis for my talk today. Louis-Philippe predicted yesterday that we would have 100 people on this call. And last time I looked, we had 97. So you were off by 3. And finally, I want to
No,
commend,
check again, Barry. We are at 100 right now.
and I want to commend you also for your timing. If you look at Paul Volcker's memoirs, the book Trading Places, he will remind you that the meeting at Camp David, at which it was ultimately decided to close the gold window, began shortly after 1 p.m. on Friday, August 13th, 1971. So how many of these characters can you recognize? I think I see Herb Stein here back in the funny sports coat. So that's the end of the story, the collapse of Bretton Woods. I think we should start at the beginning of the story. I would start with the observation that Bretton Woods was the one time in history when a monetary system emerged in whole cloth out of an international negotiation. So there had been various international monetary conferences in the 19th century to talk about gold versus silver, to try to get everyone on a common monetary standard that didn't really amount to much. There was the Brussels conference in 1920 and the Genoa conference in 1922 that again didn't amount to much. Bretton Woods was different in that an international agreement initially involving 44 countries, but ultimately including many more, emerged out of this monetary conference at Bretton Woods, reflecting special circumstances, that this was the United States unipolar moment. The US was the undisputed leader of the so-called free world. So the Soviet Union was present at Bretton Woods, although it didn't remain a member of the International Monetary Fund. Its delegation was mainly involved in leading rounds of drinks in the subterranean bar after the day's negotiations were through. But the United States was ultimately able to dictate the form of the Bretton Woods system. It didn't have to do as much dictating as it might have, because there existed broad agreement on the desirable structure of the post-World War II international monetary system. There was what John Eichengreen refers to as an epistemic community of like-minded individuals who'd been discussing these problems for a while. And you will know how the US and UK Treasury had been passing draft plans back and forth across the Atlantic for some years. And finally, in 1944, when the conference was held, World War II was still raging. Obviously, the Germans and the Japanese were not players in these negotiations. And I think there's reason to ponder whether there was truly something special about the Bretton Woods system, because its life coincided with the 30 glorious years of rapid economic growth, unlike exceeding anything we saw before or have seen since. So the question I would add to Lilia's is whether the Bretton Woods system was in part responsible for, whether it played a causal role in the 30 glorious years. Our world and our monetary system are different. The question is how different from Bretton Woods. So there are some authors, like those whose Handbook of International Economics chapter I flag on the right, who argue not very different, actually, from Bretton Woods. Exchange rates are not all that flexible. They're not significantly more flexible than before, they argue. Important emerging markets like China retain significant capital controls, as most countries did under Bretton Woods. And the US dollar was then and remains now the dominant international and reserve currency. In contrast, I'm inclined to argue that our monetary world is significantly different from Bretton Woods. So I argued in this 1998 book, the monetary and financial environment in advanced countries developed markets is entirely different from Bretton Woods due to the wholesale removal of capital controls. Some emerging markets retain controls, again, China, but the rise of capital mobility still has been significant, even in their case. The post-Bretton Woods period has seen a significant increase in the share of emerging markets and the share of the world's population living under democratic political systems. And I argue in this book, that that has important implications for domestic and international monetary policy. It creates pressure for capital account liberalization, and it creates pressure for directing policy at goals other than simply stabilizing the exchange rate. Given the trilemma, this creates the need for greater exchange rate flexibility of one sort or another. So this is the same argument I made 20 plus years ago. I continue to make it. The book cover on the right was my editor's idea. This is before we appreciated the role of China in the international monetary and financial system. So that's the first edition from 1998. You can see the boy has grown up in the second edition from 2008, and he's verging on retirement in the third edition from 2019. So how did Bretton Woods work? The textbook view says it entailed pegged exchange rates, but with provision for those pegs to change, the adjustable peg. Gold was still the ultimate numeraire, but the dollar was convertible into gold only for official foreign holders, unlike the situation prior to March of 1933, when private as well as official holders of dollars could demand that they be converted into gold at a fixed price. Under Bretton Woods, there was more scope for internationally coordinated management of the system than before. So now we have the International Monetary Fund to oversee the operation of the system, to extend emergency assistance to governments and central banks with temporary adjustment problems. We had the gold pool of what became the G10 countries starting in the 1960s to restrain demands for gold by foreign central banks and governments with dollars, and to support the dollar's peg to gold at $35 an ounce. And finally, under Bretton Woods, unlike what had come before, capital mobility was not integral to the system. IMF members were obliged to establish convertibility for current account trade-related transactions, but not for capital account financial transactions. I would argue that textbook view is difficult to square with the facts. In fact, the adjustable peg was adjusted only relatively infrequently. Devaluation was seen as an admission of policy failure, revaluation as a blow to competitiveness. IMF oversight was lacking, so members were ostensibly obliged to give the IMF 72 hours notice prior to, so that it could approve or in principle disapprove a parity change. The UK gave the fund just 24 hours notice in both 1949 and 1967. Adjustments grew even less frequent with the passage of time because of the gradual recovery of capital mobility. If capital can find ways of flowing out of your country, discussing the possibility of devaluing your currency becomes, in your parliament, much less with the IMF, becomes riskier than before. So the frequency of parity adjustments became less over time. The system survived as long as it did because of the retention of capital controls, which could be whose relaxation could be slowed, and in exceptional cases, which could be tightened as an alternative adjustment mechanism to parity changes, although that alternative became less effective as capital mobility recovered from the disruptions of the 1930s and of World War II. And as that happened, the system became increasingly rigid and brittle. The resulting inability to adjust was most troubling in the case of the United States. As you can see here, US monetary liabilities to official foreign holders already exceeded US gold reserves at the beginning of the 1960s. Dollar devaluation was ruled out by the dollar's special role in the system and the nth country problem, namely if the US sought to raise the gold price and devalue the dollar, there was nothing to prevent other countries from moving right along with it. In addition, there was the danger that one devaluation would create expectations of another, and that would aggravate the capital outflow problem. It might lead other countries like France to liquidate their dollars, to take their dollars back to the US Treasury and demand gold in return, resulting in a international reserve shortage and a global liquidity problem. On the other hand, there would be the same kind of global reserve shortage and liquidity problem if the US instead sought to rein in its twin deficits. On the other hand, doing nothing meant that sooner or later there would be a run on the dollar, just as there had been a run on the dollar at the end of 1932 and beginning of 1933. So that's the Keynes-Triffin dilemma, if you will. Keynes had alluded to that dilemma in his World War II period writings. Triffin had actually written about it as early as 1947, and good hedgehog that he was, he kept writing about it over and over again as the Bretton Woods period progressed. Keynes' solution, an international created alternative to the dollar Bancor, was of course torpedoed by the US at Bretton Woods. Triffin's version finally came into being in 1970 with support from Henry Fowler in the US Treasury, but it was too little, too late. So I would argue in sum that Bretton Woods worked for as long as it did because of three special circumstances: low international capital mobility, which was reinforced by circumstance number two, tight financial regulation, and third, because of the dominant economic and financial position of the United States coming out of World War II, which is why I don't think we can put the genie back into the bottle, why I think we won't see anything like it again. These are not circumstances that we can, or in my view, should aspire to recreate. The collapse of Bretton Woods had a number of unanticipated consequences. It led to the Musa puzzle. Mike Musa was one of the first to observe in the 1970s that greater nominal exchange rate variability also had real consequences. It was accompanied by greater real exchange variability. So here's one dating of the end of the Bretton Woods system, the first vertical line, and you can see the real exchange rate becomes much more variable after than it was before, statistically significantly more variable at the 99% confidence level. If you think that other nominal variables like the economy-wide price level are sticky, but asset prices are not, then this behavior is not as puzzling as it might be to a good Chicago economist like Musa. Another surprise was that this greater nominal and real exchange rate variability doesn't seem to have slowed the growth of international trade, contrary to some early warnings by people like Paul de Graw. Surprise number two is that the collapse of Bretton Woods did not significantly reduce the demand for international reserves. You can see them here going up, up, up. Countries needed more reserves to lean against the undesirable effects of capital flow surges. They had and have both mercantilist and prudential motives for accumulating reserves. The Asian crisis seems to have been an important turning point where countries were reminded of the potentially dire consequences of maintaining inadequate reserves in an environment of relatively open capital accounts and relatively free international capital mobility. Another surprise is that the move to greater exchange rate flexibility was less than generally anticipated, than initially supposed. It was less than initially supposed by people like me, who thought in the 1990s that countries would be moving to the extreme of hard pegs, which are the only kind of pegs that are credible in a world of high capital mobility, or freer exchange rate flexibility. So the data that I show you on the right indicate that free floating accounts for what? A third of global GDP, together with managed floats, maybe a half. Crawling pegs and fixed rates remain important in various parts of the world. So my reinterpretation 20 years later is that the bipolar view, pun intended, that countries will move to the extremes has been borne out for advanced economies, which either have the equivalent of hard pegs as in the euro area, or allow their currencies to float relatively freely, but it hasn't been borne out for emerging markets. And that makes sense insofar as emerging markets, in some cases, retain consequential capital controls of one sort or another. Another surprise is that the insulating properties of flexible exchange rates turned out to be less than initially supposed. So there were those in the early 1970s, not a few, who thought that insulation from foreign shocks, foreign monetary shocks in particular, would be complete once countries moved to flexible rates. And we've found out with a vengeance that that's not the case. People like Steve Ternovsky, whose influential article I reproduce on the right, were early to observe this. They observed that the models, the ISLM models that people had been used to establish perfect insulation, had an underspecified financial sector. And once you added the latter, you rediscovered that insulation was incomplete. And that's what recent studies have reestablished as well, like this one from a couple of years ago coming out of the International Monetary Fund, does confirm that insulation is greater under flexible rates than peg rates, but it's far from complete. Another surprise was the continued dominance of the dollar as anchor currency for foreign central banks, as the dominant form for holding international reserves. I show you here on the right, as invoicing currency, as currency of denomination for international loans and bonds, with further consequences. So Gita Gopinath makes this point at every turn, that exchange rate flexibility gives you even less insulation from foreign shocks and less ability to adjust to external imbalances if your exports are invoiced in dollars, as is typically the case. That means that depreciating your currency won't alter their world market prices, which are denominated in dollars. Depreciating your currency, therefore, will not enhance export competitiveness. And moreover, if your external liabilities are denominated in dollars, as is often the case, there will also be adverse balance sheet effects from currency devaluation. So more reasons why countries are, why insulation provided by flexible exchange rates is incomplete, and why countries are less enthusiastic than we might have thought 50 years ago about moving to exchange rate flexibility. Finally, the last surprise is that the Triffin dilemma did not disappear. We just acquired a slightly different version of the Triffin dilemma, which is that the United States cannot continue to supply safe and liquid assets to the rest of the world indefinitely all by itself, because the US accounts for a shrinking share of global GDP over time. The ability of its fiscal system to back and service safe and liquid assets is limited by the size of its economy and the willingness of our Congress to tax its citizens. So as the global economy expands more rapidly than the US, there is a new version of the Triffin dilemma where we can either stop pumping out US Treasury securities, global liquidity shortage results, or keep pumping out US Treasury securities. And at some point, there will be a crisis of confidence of the sort that Triffin had, of which Triffin had warned. I said finally, let me say finally one more time. Another surprise is the peculiar conjuncture of exchange rate stability and financial stability. So here I have another vertical line in 2017, which shows you that exchange rates, this is the dollar-euro exchange rate, but the point is more general, seem to have settled down. They show less variability than in the previous period. How can exchange rates be so stable, relatively speaking, if other financial variables most decidedly are not? This structural break is significant at the 99% level as well, just like the 1973 one was. The authors I cited before suggest that international cooperation, Federal Reserve swap lines, and the fact that interest rates are so low around the world that financial variables differ relatively little across countries is what makes exchange rates so stable today. I would ascribe it instead, I ascribe it in a chapter in this book written together with Alan Taylor to the adoption of credible nominal anchors in the form of inflation targeting in the advanced economies and quite a number of emerging markets as well. So with that stable nominal anchor, no longer does a monetary shock that moves the exchange rate create expectations of further shocks, moving it in the same direction. Expectations are stabilizing rather than extrapolative. Alan and I show that the exchange rate between two countries is more stable if their central banks both inflation target than otherwise. Future prospects, obviously there are tensions between what is an increasingly multipolar world and what remains a dollar-dominated international monetary non-system. There is that 21st century Triffin dilemma. The Powell Fed has been a good global citizen, but the overall impression is that the US is becoming a less reliable partner. And we know from articles like this one on the right that countries tend to hold disproportionately as reserves the currencies of their alliance partners. And US alliances have frayed very considerably in the last 4+ years. But what is the alternative to the current system? I don't think an enhanced role for special drawing rights is in the offing. There is no private commercial or financial use of the SDR. If there was a latent demand, JP Morgan would have created an SDR basket, tradable SDR basket, which it hasn't. There's no capacity for the IMF to do what the Fed did in 2008 and again in March of 2020, which is to provide swap lines overnight to foreign central banks. The way I think about it is no global government means no willingness to allow the IMF to issue more SDRs over a weekend in an emergency, which means no enhanced role for the SDR. The other alternative is a multipolar international monetary system. That's what I argued in this book in 2011. It hasn't happened. And like I like to say, I'll keep arguing that it's coming until it finally arrives. In the case of the euro, the obstacle is a shortage of AAA rated public label assets. In other words, bunds and other high quality European government bonds for central banks and governments around the world to hold. Look at all these US treasuries that are out there to be held. And then look at the total euro safe assets. Then subtract off the ones that have to be held by euro area commercial banks as reserves. Subtract off the ones that have been hoovered up by the ECB. And there aren't a lot of freely available, high quality, safe public label euros to be held as reserves. Maybe the European Recovery Fund will change that in the long run. In the case of the renminbi, I think the obstacle is mainly political. Capital controls are an obstacle to renminbi internationalization, but the point I would emphasize is different, that every true international and reserve currency in history has been the currency of a political republic or democracy, because there are checks and balances in such a system on arbitrary action by the executive. And you will know that China is moving away from checks and balances on arbitrary action by the executive as we speak today. So central banks are going to be reluctant to put their reserves, park them in Shanghai, because Mr. Xi can do to them what he did to Jack Ma if he puts its mind to it. I think that's not a constraint that's going to be relaxed anytime soon. Finally, cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, central bank digital currencies. We can talk about this in the Q&A. I think the only one that's here to stay in any meaningful sense will be here to stay is central bank digital currencies. But making them interoperable is a formidable task. And I don't think it's gonna, to put it bluntly, happen in my lifetime. So I actually had a Project Syndicate piece a few days ago on whether central bank digital currencies doom dollar dominance. And the answer, in my view, is no. So I think that's lots to chew on. Lilia's final question was, and then I'll stop, are we better off or worse off today than we were under Bretton Woods? Better or worse is a normative judgment. The positive statement, to my mind, is though there is continuity, the current system is significantly different, greater capital mobility, fewer controls, more political democracy, a more multipolar world. There is no going back to Bretton Woods, however nostalgic we might be, but Bretton Woods-like tensions remain. I don't see a clear way of relieving those tensions in the short run, other than hoping that the euro and the renminbi will gradually overcome their obstacles and that the Fed will continue to recognize its international responsibilities. So I expect the international monetary turbulence, even if it has died down for the moment, to be back. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. And I think because of a time constraint, we may take maybe 3 questions now, and then 3 questions from Matthias at the end of his presentation. And then if there is more time, we will take more questions afterwards for both or either of you. So any question now for Barry? No? No questions. Well, then perhaps the best thing to do is...
There is one question from Devika.
I didn't see any hand.
One from Robert Gutman.
Oh, yes, Robert Gutman. Okay, please.
I'm very
Robert,
much
Robert, if you don't mind, Devika had her hand up first.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes,
so let's go with Devika first. Thank you.
Thanks, Louis-Philippe. Thank you so much for a great presentation, Professor Eichengreen. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering if the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of changed some of your predictions in terms of the declining dollar dominance because of the declining share of US GDP in world GDP, especially since the US is the only country that I mean, that is kind of coming back in terms of fiscal stimulus. The European Union has tied its hands in several ways in a non-recovery sort of way. The rest of the world is languishing to even control the health crisis. And not that the US has controlled the health crisis, but since given the vaccination rates are much higher in the US and fiscal stimulus is much larger and has been for a while, do you think that at least in some ways does it delay any decline or any like worsening of the Triffin dilemma in terms of the dollar dominance for now?
Some of us were having a discussion right prior to this session of how long COVID-related difficulties will persist. The answer is none of us know. I remain of the view that the logic of convergence is intact, that emerging markets will continue to emerge, that the United States will continue to account for a declining share of global GDP over time. There are going to be plenty of chronic problems for emerging markets. Reconfiguring global supply chains is not going to be easy. Trade tensions are going to persist. But I do think, as I said, the logic of convergence is intact. And that implies that at some point, the 21st century Triffin dilemma will bite.
Okay, so I see there are 3 more hands, if I'm correct. So let's take all of them and then we stop it because we have to give the floor to Matthias. So Robert, please.
Yes, I have a question about the eventual multipolar system emerging, but the conditions for the exchange rate stabilization that you pointed to after 2017 no longer holding in the 2020s, because either your explanation or the other explanation are going to basically being frayed now. You have central banks, the Fed and the European Central Bank, basically abandoning or slowly relaxing the inflation targeting. And secondly, you also have the zero bound is going to end at some point after the recovery from the post-COVID, in which case there may be more exchange rate instability. And I was wondering whether, as we're moving slowly through the 21st century version of the Triffin dilemma to some kind of multipolar configuration, which you have argued in the past consistently, whether the idea of target zones would be useful. And in that case, it would be interesting to figure out from you what you think of what happened with the Louvre agreement, and whether there's the underlying stabilization issues that were discussed before the Louvre agreement collapsed or even was shaped in Tokyo, namely to have a deeper coordination of policy mixes, whether there's any chance for that if we go through this transition to a greater multipolar system that is inherently more unstable.
So I agree with the premise that exchange rate volatility will be back, that questions are being asked about inflation targeting. I think in virtually every country that has inflation targeting central bank, those regimes will retain their credibility. I think stability culture is now deeply ingrained in the central banking world, but as interest rates move away from the zero lower bound, different conditions in different countries will imply different levels and changes in levels of interest rates. So exchange rates will move more. I do not think there is practical scope, however desirable it may be in principle, for greater international monetary policy cooperation, much less for target zones. So think a target zone is only as credible as the commitment to defend it at its border. And I know very few central banks, one, a National Bank of Denmark, that exercises that kind of credibility. When push comes to shove, do you raise the interest rate to prevent the exchange rate from moving beyond the edge of the zone, or do you lower it in response to rising unemployment? I have a bet about which priority will prevail.
Okay, thanks. I think next one is Fernando Toledo. Are you going to ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Okay, let's go to Orkun. Is that right? Is that the right pronunciation?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Congratulations to Barry Eichengreen for your excellent presentation. I would like to know your opinion about a topic that maybe could be of interest according to the topic that you discussed previously. Concretely, I'm thinking about the importance or the growing importance that the global financial cycle, an issue that I like to study, could have on emerging market and developing economies monetary policy, particularly considering the growing financial integration and the fact that the Fed decisions about the administration of its monetary policy instrument surely has an influence on monetary policy decisions and exchange rates on emerging market developing economic governments. So I would like to know your vision about this interesting topic.
I think my friend Helene Ray has made an important contribution with her dilemma rather than trilemma work, but she overstates her point. In other words, the way I put it in my presentation is that flexible exchange rates provide only partial insulation from global or external monetary and financial shocks, but they still can provide some insulation, perhaps under some circumstances and not others. So I subscribe to the Obstfeld version of the argument and not the Ray version of the argument that the global financial cycle is important, but exchange rate flexibility can provide some partial insulation in response.
Thanks.
Okay, Orkun. You have to switch on your microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you. Barry, I should first thank you for your book, Globalizing Capital. I read it some years ago. It was very enlightening for me to understand international monetary system. Actually, before a question, I should present you my book here. It is called The Theory of Capitalism. I wrote some months ago. I finished. I actually explain how the economy works here, like how the monetary system works, how the capital, how the real economy works. And first of all, to Barry, I request you to take a look to my book. And you said Bretton Woods system, we cannot return to Bretton Woods system, but the main problem is the money, expansionary monetary system, and the monetary system is expanding. This causes a growth-based economic system, and it is caused a deflationary system, as you might know. Keynes explained it in the before Bancorp. So, but maybe not capital controls or we can't impose capital controls now in the world economic system. But do you think there should be a rebalancing mechanism that limits surpluses, trade surpluses, like Germany's trade surpluses, China's trade surpluses?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, this was argument at the original Bretton Woods conference. It remains an issue, unresolved issue today. It's an issue within the Euro area, Germany's surpluses and all that. I think given the fact that surplus countries tend to be in a strong position more often than not politically, as well as economic and financially, this is a hard nut to crack, and we've been trying to do something about it for the better part of a century now.
So,
Okay. Do you mind if we stop here and we give the microphone to Matthias? Okay. So please, Matthias Vernengo, he will talk about the consolidation of dollar hegemony after the collapse of Bretton Woods, bringing power back in. Please.
Let me mute myself. So first of all, this is a tough job to follow Barry on this. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, thanks Lilia for the presentation, and I also want to emphasize that I've read several of your books, including papers, and including the book on Malthus, History of Thought being one of my sort of interest, and more recently your stuff on Augusto Graziani.
Oh.
So we actually are for the Palgrave, the new Palgrave dictionary of economics that I co-edited with Steven and Barclay Rosser, where Ricardo Realfonso accepted to write an entry on Graziani. So I see my role here a bit of a spoiler, and to try to suggest that there are different views, as Lilia sort of suggested. I'm broadly speaking, as Marc Lavoie would say, a broad tent post-Keynesian sort of scholar. And in this, I want to say that Barry has been very nice to heterodox groups in economics. He came to Kalamazoo. He went to Utah. And I might be wrong on this, but he wrote for the Review of Keynesian Economics, which I shouldn't bring up, but given that it's a rope seminar, but Philippe was one of the founders, so I think it's okay. That he was, he once told me, and I think I recall this correctly, that he was a roommate of Jamie Galbraith at Yale. So I blame Jamie Galbraith for giving him a little bit of interest in what we post-Keynesians perhaps have to say about some of these issues. So what I intend to say is, so I do agree with Barry on a very important issue. So I do believe that Bretton Woods is gone, and I do believe that we're not coming back to that. I also want to point out that that bringing power back in there, it's to some extent a discussion exactly of some of these ideas of what happened with Bretton Woods, and it will not appear in my PowerPoint, but it is worth noticing that the 70s, the period of crisis that follows the end of Bretton Woods, it's exactly the period in which heterodox economics does appear as a separate sort of discipline. Is also obviously the period in which neoliberal policies sort of become more dominant. It started I should say, in Latin America, in Chile and in Argentina, in fact, in the Southern Cone. But also at the moment in which a certain group within political science, which Barry has been engaged with, in international political economy, sort of break, Susan Strange and others break from conventional views and and move in directions that are similar to heterodox economics. So I think that those three things are not coincidental, and I suggest certain things about that in the paper. So the need of bringing power back in, which in my view passes through some reconsideration of ideas of classical political economy and the surplus approach, meaning the old classical political economy, and hence an abandonment of certain ideas of marginalism. So what I'll try to do with the time I have is essentially suggest, as I said, it's my role I see as a little bit of a spoiler, and trying to suggest here that there are different views that, you know, and I'm also, I'm not sure, a lot of what I'm going to say, I'm pretty sure that many people will, you know, broadly speaking, post-Keynesians will disagree with what I'll say. And, you know, we're a small group, but, you know, we're fractious, like the People's Front of Judea, I suppose, and in the life of Brian. So we have our internal differences. And so I by no means suggest that this is a view that everybody sort of would accept, but this comes from a mix of certain, you know, sort of ideas that bring not just classical political economy and Keynesian ideas together, but also a good chunk of, as Lilia suggested, I do work on Latin American structuralism, so some ideas that come from the groups at my alma mater at the Federal University in Rio that have been instrumental, in particular, I should say, the work of you know, Maria da Conceição Tavares, Andrés Serrano, and others. So that's where some of this comes from. And so I would suggest that there are two fundamental views about the collapse of Bretton Woods. I will probably not go back to the beginning as Barry did. I didn't know or never noticed what Lilia suggested, that Keynes had a discussion of a dollar standard early on in the 20s. So that was a sort of a welcome sort of little piece of information for me. And I would suggest that the conventional view is one that suggests that it's an economic problem. So at the end of the day, you have some sort of structural problem that limits the ability of the US to maintain the functioning of the system. Whereas the alternative view would emphasize the political pressures within the United States that force, you know, eventually for a political decision, which is the way I see the Nixon decision in '71. But you know, again, going to Lilia's question at the beginning, I do agree that there is a broad period there from the 60s, you know, whenever, you know, late 60s, the gold pool, you know, in 68, you know, to 73, the Smithsonian Agreement, that are all fair game in terms of defining when, you know, the Bretton Woods system finally is gone, in a sense. But I do think that 71 it's not a bad date, actually, and I'll suggest why. I will also suggest that, contrary to conventional views, which suggest that Bretton Woods is the beginning of the end of dollar hegemony, and that may sort of imply many different things, may imply what Barry suggested, that the world will slowly, very slowly perhaps, but you know, eventually move to a multipolar world. That although there are obviously challenges to the dollar, you know, more now than, you know, 50 years ago in many ways, I suggest that this is the culmination of the hegemonic rise of the dollar. I will suggest that these sort of two contrasting views are based on these differences of what we may call a chartal sort of view of money and a, you know, metallic view of money, and I will also try to suggest that if you're going to hold, like I do, a chartal view of international money, you have to say something about the resilience of metallic standards. Why only 50 years ago? So I'll try to say something about that if I have time. I will, you know, sort of make a parallel there between the demonetization of silver in the late 19th century during the gold standard, which is associated to the rise of the pound, with the demonetization of gold with the rise of the dollar. And we'll emphasize the difference between that in domestic and foreign currency, which I think it's central for the difference between center and periphery, or, you know, in modern terminology, advanced versus emerging markets, or something along those lines. So the conventional view is, you know, founded on the notion that the US had a lack of commitment to price stability, that the lack of commitment to price stability is, and the unwillingness to some extent of certain countries, Germany at the top, but France, Japan, and so on, to accept higher levels of inflation, puts pressure on the dollar. There is also, within the conventional view, there is, I would say, something that it seems more interesting. They're not incompatible views, something that suggests that there is a deeper contradiction. And that deeper contradiction is the clash within the role of the United States, well, I should say the international role of the United States, and the needs of the domestic economy in the United States appear, of course, as Barry had there, the Trente Glorieuses, the golden age of capitalism, so that you have here a period in which the welfare state is expanding, that full employment policies are relevant, and so on and so forth. And so, that also, would suggest a clash, because the idea here was still very much so. It's in NERCs, it's in almost all the relevant authors of the time, Keynes being perhaps an exception, that capital mobility is a good thing, and that at the end of the day, because of allocation of resources and whatnot, but the needs of the domestic economy require this sort of second best solution, and so they agreed to the introduction of capital controls under the circumstances of what had been the interwar period and whatnot. And so here you have a situation in which, for domestic reasons, you need low interest rates to promote full employment policies, according to this view. There are some inverse relationships between investment and interest rates, and you need higher rates of interest if you are to avoid, in a context in which you don't have capital controls, you would have needed higher interest rates to preclude capital flight. So that's the compromise, so to speak, that appears with Bretton Woods. And I should say, I forgot to say a couple of things. So there's one school that I forgot. I think it's central to a lot of what I'm going to say. It's Kindleberger. So another school that appears there in the 70s, in a sense. I'm not sure one would call it a school, but it's certainly a set of theories. And Barry has written actually a review of those, the hegemonic stability theories of money. And Kindleberger is central, and that appears also there as, I think, a preoccupation with inability to explain in the conventional view what happened during Bretton Woods. The conventional explanation, and I always say, and I get some of the scholars of neoliberalism angry with that, and they emphasize a lot Hayek and Montpellerin and the importance of the movement, and I always think that Friedman and marginalism, even his brand of marginalism, which is empiricist and Marshallian and whatnot, is central for neoliberalism. And here, I think theoretically you see why. I think the two arguments that sort of make a good case for why the system was problematic and how you solve those within the marginalist sort of analysis are in Friedman. One is flexible exchange rates. And the other, is the idea that the system has a tendency to the natural rate. That natural rate of interest, of course, once you have the loanable funds on a global basis, you'll have the capital flows sort of adjust, and allocate resources internationally correctly. That view, as I said, is often sort of authors like Metzler, which I think can be classified as a neoclassical synthesis Keynesian, perfectly accepted, and saw deviations as imperfections, very much like, say, Hicks and Modigliani and others saw real nominal wage rigidities, pardon me, as a imperfection of the functioning of the system. So clearly, Bretton Woods, as it was said, it didn't had an automatic solution for the imbalances, and Barry gave you three reasons of why, even though it didn't have, it sort of worked for a while. The other way of looking at this is, of course, the sort of dollar glut problem, and that is associated to the Triffin dilemma. Ultimately, And so the idea that and he showed you the data there of the growing of the liabilities of the U.S. in dollars with no counterpart in the increase of gold reserves. So that's sort of the story there. As I said, this, in my view, this it's follows a conception of money that it's medalist and a view of inflation that one may call monetarist. So Friedman wasn't there for as a mistake, and I think that we can sort of think of the alternative as starting from actually, interestingly enough, from the ideas of Keynes in the treaties, where he clearly recognizes the notion that money is state money. We wrote long ago with Philippe, I think I cited later in the presentation, a paper in which we sort of criticize some elements of in the long history of the rise of money, cartelist or state view of the origins of money, but that's of minor concern here. Keynes actually, there are a couple of things that I think are important here. Keynes actually does understand, whether he has that in the general theory or not, it's of minor importance to me. He clearly says that he thinks that the idea of the natural rate of interest is a bad idea, that that he used it for in the treaties, and that it should be abandoned. And in that respect, so this external exogenous interest rate that it's at the end of the day determined by the central bank, and here it will be central, the hegemonic, the central bank of the country that holds the hegemonic currency, that will play an important role in the functioning of the system in ways that in the conventional view it won't matter. So for Keynes, I should say also very briefly, the idea of capital controls, here is something that it's beyond the notion of a necessary evil. It's actually a positive good. It's part of a broader regime. Again, whatever you think about the way he explains necessarily the euthanasia of the rentier, I think that it's part of a preoccupation with a regime here in which interest rates are kept low, so that the expansion of both public and private debt are not as instabilizing as they were in the interwar period. And that regime of accumulation actually does end up working for peculiar reasons, which include the existence of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the importance of the United States, and some of the others that Barry also sort of suggested. But in this alternative view, I should say, there is nothing necessarily that would preclude the United States by the 1960s to still maintain. So the system here, you can think of the system as working very much in ways that are similar, if you want, with what I'm going to say is. People will cringe, I suppose, with the gold standard, in the sense that it wasn't really, the gold standard was a pound system, and this is a dollar system, although it's tied to gold, and essentially, the United States can provide significant amounts of liquidity. It could have risen, the interest rates if there was some sort of speculation and attract flows, and at the same time, it could spend fiscal policy and promote full employment at home, of course, with a higher burden of that, which we have done since the Reagan years, and with no significant, I should say, negative effects on the position of the dollar internationally. So from that point of view, I don't think that actually there was a significant limitation in that respect in the functioning of the system. Mind you, the United States at that point was not running persistent current account deficits, so that would have, of course, created problems if anybody saw that the United States, couldn't at the end, the ultimate source of gold reserves would be a surplus in the current account that they didn't have. But by the 60s, that's still not yet a significant issue. So what I see as the fundamental sort of view of why the Bretton Woods system eventually ends up collapsing is associated to the very good work by Eric Kleiner who once told me his dad told him not to study economics and go into political science, which he also regretted. And because there are problems there too, but at any rate, he shows, I think, very, very thoroughly that the reasons for the end of Bretton Woods are to some extent associated to the strong financial interest within the United States. We can here use the, I think, fantastic phrase by Jagdish Bhagwati, old one on the capital myth in foreign affairs, in which he refers to the Wall Street Treasury complex. That they wanted to open financial markets. And I would suggest also that there was some understanding that this was a constraint on the United States. So that the United States, at the end of the day, if they ended up running current account deficits, this would impose an additional constraint. And so there was sort of a need to get rid of this constraint. Nixon himself says something to the fact to preserve the position of the dollar. Whether he understood that or not is, obviously something open to debate. And hence, for me, if it's a political reason, the question is why politically this could happen. Why was at this moment in the early 70s the system ripe for the significant momentous change in which we transitioned to a dollar fiat system, a global fiat system, the first time in history. And the reasons for that, I think, are in a little paper, well explained in a little paper by Koletsky and Kovalik on the strength that the Golden Age period provided to the working class. And so that in many ways you had now at the top political pressure from financial elites to open up the euro market and so on and so forth. The euro as dollars in the city of London, not the euro now, and not significant resistance from below. So the working class, as they say, was reformist, not revolutionary or something along those lines. And I think of the rifts in the Democratic Coalition and the fact that the Vietnam War and that the hard hats in New York, against the students. I think things that are still with us. I hear some sort of background, so somebody has the microphone. So that's let me rush a little bit because I see I have like 10 minutes and I haven't discussed much of the alternative view in many ways. So one of the important things here, if I'm going to defend this position, is that I have to say something about why in a charter system in which power, which I associate to the power to actually in this case in international, so we have a paper in the review of international political economy on that with an ex-student on hegemonic currencies, and we suggest that it's the ability to control the price of key commodities, energy commodities, that is central for the key currency, why metallic standards were so resilient, and why they remained dominant until just 50 years ago. And here I think that there is an interesting parallel to understand with the silver demetallization, the crime of 1873, as Friedman referred to, and many authors, of course, but he has a paper, I think, titled, like that, and the rise of the pound, which I suggest, those two things happen together, and the demonetization of gold, which I see as again the rise of the dollar. So one of the important things is why metallic money was used in the first place. If you have that state, in ancient times for sure, less so in modern times. Modern, I mean late medieval period, that you have metallic currencies, and on that we have written with Philippe, I should say. So at any rate, part of the story is that in the period in which you have the creation of public debt, which is an European sort of invention. These are all initially tiny city-states that their ability to impose their unit of account, so this is a charterist sort of view, charterless in the broad sense, not necessarily the state, but charterless in the sense that it's power. So hence power back in. That power determines your ability to determine what's the language, what's the dictionary, Keynes would say. And these are tiny city-states that their ability to borrow and repay in their own token is associated to the control of international trade routes. And those are, settled, again, current accounts are important and settled in metallic. And in many ways, I see the persistence of this in the case of, as we move to not anymore city-states, but territorial states, like in particular England, that eventually as trade moves to the Atlantic and to Asia and control of that directly around Africa. That loses sort of importance in a polity in which you can actually tax your population in domestic currency, and so control of trade routes becomes less relevant. And somebody may say, so why do we end up still with the gold standard? And I suggest in the paper that it's a spandrel, using here the biological architectural sort of, it's a feature that it's there like our appendices, that has no function. And that it was there as an accident in many ways. So Barry, in his book that everybody cited tells the story of Newton and how England ends up in a gold standard. And so the gold standard is the British system, and that becomes a global system as the pound becomes the central sort of currency. Of course, in this story, the sort of problems for the pound are associated to the fact that by the First World War, England is forced to accumulate that in foreign currency. So here what's central is the fact that you have that in domestic currency versus that in foreign currency. I see the system of the pound and the gold standard, again, a system that was, as Marcello De Cecco, which I think I cited there somewhere, but maybe I lost that, essentially the pound system implied that they could, lend and do all of those things that Kindleberger tells us in his book. So expand demand on a global basis, act as a lender of last resort, coordinate macroeconomic policies, lend long, and so on and so forth to maintain the system functioning. And those could be done with, the manipulation of the rate of interest, as Keynes famously said. And only in situations in which there was a fundamental threat to the state, England was forced to withdraw, obviously the Napoleonic Wars, and then when it's forced really to get indebted in foreign currency. So I think that's the sort of reason why you had that, and so the monetization of silver comes exactly from the fact that it didn't play an important role in the British system. And so let me jump a little bit here and get closer to my conclusion. As I suggested, in this system, what I think it's important to understand is that the ability of the US to borrow in its own currency has not changed significantly. So the end of Bretton Woods did not imply the end of the ability of the United States to borrow in its own currency. The United States has not accumulated significant reserves in foreign currencies. It has not affected the ability of the United States to maintain militarily. Essentially, when I mean here power, I mean military power to some extent. The ability to have the key commodities priced in its own currency. And you see the counterpart even on countries that, groups like, if we think of the euro, I think 10 years ago, it was more, common to suggest that the euro might have been the alternative to the dollar than the renminbi. And they do have to accumulate significant reserves in dollars, and preferably they will have to maintain a current account surpluses. So there is with the discussion of the global financial cycles of the Landray and Borio and others, there is this notion that current accounts don't matter anymore. And that's, at the end of the day, I think a problematic proposition if you think in terms of center and periphery, because peripheral countries, sure enough, they can maintain for very long periods, current account deficits. But at the end of the day, the only source of secure funds to pay for debts and service the debts in international currency is their exports, and hence they do have to maintain surpluses in the current account. And you see that on the all key players that are not, the hegemonic currency. So Germans maintain their surpluses, and that's even within the euro structure. The Japan, China, and so on and so forth. So I think that that's an important element of the system, and it's instrumental of how this new sort of global fiat system, which I in the book that we edited on dollarization, which Barry has a chapter, I call that dollarization lato sensu. So I think that we have several countries that are dollarized stricto sensu. I mean, some literally, legally, El Salvador, Panama, Ecuador, but and some that are informally, like Argentina and so on and so forth. But I think that globally we're dollarized, and so there is we live in a dollarized system in ways that we didn't live before. And so in that sense, I think we're in a more dollarized world. So very briefly, I don't want to repeat a lot of what's said here is repetition. So let me just say the parts that are not repetition. So I think that a lot of the problems to understand this alternative view, and again, as I say, the alternative view might sort of overrepresent certain views and underrepresent certain ideas here, and so I'm not suggesting that this is a view that post-Keynesians per se all agree on, as much as I think that I simplified extremely what conventional view sort of suggests, and there are many nuances as sort of evident from Barry's presentation. But I think they do derive from the fact that mainstream economics derived from neoclassical marginalist economics skews the issue of power. And so this is a blind spot, and it's a particularly important blind spot when you're dealing with something that involves the power of the state to impose the dictionary. And so this is why it's so important in this particular field. Heinz Kurz has written a very interesting and worthwhile reading paper exactly on that, and how not just one of the heterodox groups. So here he cites classical Marxian, Kalecki, Post-Keynesians, and many other groups that I think, and I would agree with him, have had, and you can put circuitists and many others that we're leaving out, but that do try to do that. And I suggest in the paper that international political economy and hegemonic stability theories also try to do that. And so that there is in the 70s an understanding that this somehow has been left out of the discussions in the profession. So going to the last thing that I'll say, which goes to something that Barry also commented at the end. So where's the direction of this? So I would agree with him that we are not going back to Bretton Woods. And I would also agree that the US is being challenged, and that the position of the dollar is not necessarily unassailable. And I also agree with him. He suggested very clearly that this sort of changes might be considerably far in the future. So that it's no way of for us to necessarily know when this will happen. But I would suggest that there is an important element that gives ability and continuity to the position of the dollar as of right now. First of all, I do believe with Fred Block, the sociologist, that the United States does have still an operational, even if problematic, hidden developmental state. So the ability of the United States to spend in its own currency and borrow in its own currency and promote with that process of development, expanding demand, all of those things that Kindler-Berger, Kindler-Berger is the one that actually conceptualizes it, expanding demand globally and so on and so forth. And that's why I think the Fed has been used very sparingly, to do swaps rather than the IMF and whatnot. So we do agree that SDRs will have no role. But in ways that other contenders, China, Europe, whoever you might think, do not have, because they do have to maintain, as we saw, significant amounts, Barry had the graph, significant amounts of reserves in dollars, and that implies that they must maintain surpluses in their current account in ways that the United States is not forced. So this goes to the bulk, to the core of what changed with Bretton Woods. the United States had a restriction, and that restriction was lifted with the end of Bretton Woods. And I think that has in fact enhanced the ability of the United States to maintain the hegemonic currency, which of course doesn't mean that it will be the hegemonic currency forever. That's another story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, are there questions for Matthias, who gave us a very interesting talk, original?
If I may suggest something, I would leave it open to debate. So I know that there'll be questions for me, and I'm happy to reply, but I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't use Barry. We have Barry here, so we should have questions and have the questions with everybody.
Well, I will propose that you make questions to both, and they will decide which question they should answer. Okay?
Sounds good.
Please, I think the first one was Robert Gatman. I see 4 hands at the moment.
Yeah, as we're moving towards a multipolar world, I was wondering whether you have any opinions on the fact that the 3 poles, the US, the European Union, and China, may represent different variants of capitalism that are about struggling to define themselves in a way post-COVID. There's a lot of turmoil policy-wise in each of these 3 poles. And to what extent that could be an important factor going forward beyond the simple claim that you have to have a democracy for having a world money. So either one of you two, on the variance of capitalism and the emerging international monetary system.
If I may say something very briefly, and then if Barry wants to say something too. So I'm sure you've read Branko Milanovic's book on that, and and I think you're right that there are capitalisms that there's an extensive literature, which I think it's important on the varieties of capitalism. And I think that certainly plays a role here. Although I'm not sure that the way it plays, it's between democracy and autocracy. So I'm more skeptical of that. I think in many ways, I might say actually the opposite of what Barry is going to say or said before, because I think that the United States, because of the bickering, perhaps we're going to pass a bipartisan infrastructure bill and even an important progressive sort of extension of the welfare state and the developmental state for a broader share of the population, not just the elites and corporations. So, but I think that the United States has been paralyzed. So I think that one of the problems of the confusion within the Republican Party is that the United States' ability to lead globally has been sort of incapacitated in ways that the Chinese version of capital. I mean, it's amazing how there is a little map that people were showing these days on Twitter about how many countries have flipped and have now China as their main trading partner, rather than and how aggressively they're trying to pursue the expansion of the role of the renminbi in those countries, and making them borrow in renminbi and having conditionality that it's actually, frankly, very harsh, like the IMF conditionality. And so I'm not sure. I think that you're right, and I think that the varieties of capitalism play a role, but I'm not sure it's precisely a question of democracy versus autocracy. So China has a lot of public investment. So,
Barry, would you like to say something about this?
Briefly, it makes me think about the Euro area, think about the difference between the German model and the Italian model, or the German model and the Greek model, having different economic model where the economy and the state are organized differently and levels of public spending or deficit spending vary across economies, creates tension within a unified monetary zone. I think it would create less tension globally because there is that exchange rate to adjust, which is not the case within the Euro area. I think the point I made in my talk about how countries tend to hold as reserves the currencies of their alliance partners is relevant in this context. Countries whose economic models will resemble that of China may be more inclined to hold the renminbi as reserves than otherwise. but more broadly, I don't think that countries have to have compatible, similar economic models in order for their currencies to coexist on the global stage.
Can I say something, just one word, that some of the governors of the Bank of Italy in the 60s and 70s thought that Italy should overcome its productivity gap before they could proceed to economic and monetary unification. So it's not so different from what you're saying. And I think this is still the main gap between Italy and Germany, say. So now I would like to give the microphone to Bradley Bordis. You have to switch on.
Thank you, Lilia. Thank you so much. And it's particularly nice to follow just from what you said now, which is the question that Italian central bankers were considering about productivity gap. I'm also, I look forward, I haven't yet read your book on Malthus. I look forward to reading it. I'm predominantly a student in the history of economic thought. And I'm particularly mad about, I love the mercantilists. I think that Adam Smith's idea, I call it Adam Smith's crap idea, that the purpose of all production is to satisfy the consumer. And what an absolutely, utterly crap idea that was. And so along that thought, Barry showed a very interesting graph showing the relative stability of exchange rates, which then explodes in 71 when the Bretton Woods system was adopted. And he makes the very fascinating point that trade was not disrupted. And that was followed by another fascinating graph showing the different regimes, fixed regimes. I think it was managed float, pegged regimes, managed floats, and then free floating. So my question to both panelists, or for all three, whoever wants to answer, is the tendency has been to focus on trade, on the even Bretton Woods. The purpose of Bretton Woods was to get trade going again. My question is does it result in a different set of variables if instead of focusing on trade, we focus on production? And what is the correlation between high levels of production and fixed and managed floats versus what production does in a free floating regime?
There is some literature on the exchange rate regime and economic growth. Do countries with flexible rates grow faster or slower than countries with pegged rates? And as people on this call will know, the literature is inconclusive. It doesn't speak clearly. I don't think we know. What we do know is there are other things that are much more important for economic growth.
If I may say something on that relates to something I said in the talk, Bradley. I think I did say that England was eventually forced to borrow in foreign currency, and I think you're right to point out that one of the reasons, it's production, not necessarily just trade. England had to have by the way, the idea that the current account surpluses were necessary, it's very well sort of discussed in Marcello De Cecco's book on the gold standard, money and empire, and so empire, the issue of power there is smack at center, and India played a role that was central. So what allowed England to maintain the system, but they lose it because they don't have the material resources to win the war. And I think that that's an important thing. But my point is that there is a financial basis to that. The ability to spend more or less, if you're borrowing in your currency, you can, more or less spend without certain limits. And so the possibility of default vanishes. It doesn't mean that there are no consequences again. So that's another discussion. we don't necessarily need to bring MMT on this, but I think that's an important point. So I think that there is a connection between having the hegemonic currency and the ability to be ahead in production, and that's. But again, you have to have the developmental state and the ability, and thinking in those terms. The United States had a tradition of having that. Barry's colleague at Berkeley, Brad DeLong, has a book with Stephen Cohen exactly on that Hamiltonian tradition of policy within the United States. Whether that tradition is still alive or not, it's to be seen.
Is there Andres Arauz? Did he want to ask a question? Is he still around?
No, he has to leave, but he put the question in the chat.
Oh.
And you guys can read it. Could the panelists comment on the role of the petrodollar, energy commodities priced in US dollars, and all that follows, given the recent EU discussion on this, its relationship to climate change and related currency coercion, evidenced by the wars against Iraq and Libya?
Okay, please. Barry, or who wants to talk first? Barry.
On this one, I'll talk last.
Matthias?
Yeah, well, it goes. So it's a pity he left, but and it's a pity he lost the election. I should say too, in my view, but that's in Ecuador. So I think he's right. I mean, as I said, I tend to view one of the differences I had with in terms of chartal views of money is that with Louis Philippe, who wrote a paper long ago in which he suggested that if you look at modern money, again, going back to city-states in Italy and whatnot, that money was first international and then domestic. And we wrote that paper in 2003, and there is a very good book again by Eric Kleiner saying that territorial currencies only happened in the 19th century. He puts more emphasis than us on the technical conditions to avoid counterfeiting and things like that. And we put more emphasis on the political reasons why they could sort of force the notes of the Bank of England and so on and so forth. So one of the things we suggest with David Fields in our right paper is exactly that the pricing of oil in dollars and other key commodities is sort of central to a chartal view of money these days, more than the ability of the United States to tax people in its own currency and whatnot. But that's so it goes in the direction of agreeing that, and I think it explains a lot of the why the U.S. has this hidden empire, as Wolf calls it. There's 900 military bases around the world and so on and so forth. So.
Okay, there was another hand, but I can't see it. James Cotton.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. It was great talk. So many wide areas of thought, but I think that the question that comes to me is, how could it go wrong for US hegemony? I mean, you're quite confident that it will continue, given the political economy.
I'm not confident of anything in this domain, but I do see the continued dominance of the dollar because of the lack of alternatives. Show me an alternative. There aren't safe euros as an alternative. There aren't accessible, reliable renminbi as an alternative. The other currencies are minnows. The digital units are infants, and most of them are not going to survive to adulthood. So, the dollar being the cleanest dirty shirt in the pile, that phrase people have been using for a long time, I think will remain the case for a while going forward, unless you can quickly tell me which aspect of my preceding assertion is wrong.
I tend to agree.
Okay, perhaps I will ask the last question if there are no other hands raised. I would like to recall what Antonio Gramsci used to say about pessimism of intelligence and optimism of will. So I would like to ask both of you, particularly Barry, because I know he has been writing a lot about it, but also Matthias, about the possibility to reintroduce some kind of capital controls on, at least on speculative flows, hot money, what used to be called speculative money, hot money. And if so, in which sense? Do we need capital controls or taxes like the Tobin tax or something like that? Can you say something? And can you say if we have some shade of optimism about this, considering that governments are now trying to introduce some kind of regulations like the minimum tax or the transition to a green economy. So there is some kind of re-regulation, or at least some attempt at re-regulation. So can we have some kind of hope that concerted action by governments may lead in this direction, in the direction of reducing harmful capital mobility, not the good one? Finished. My question is finished. Can you answer?
So let me say something very brief, and so Barry can sort of conclude. So very briefly, I think that on an individual basis, it happens. I mean, Argentina it wasn't even reimposed by the left of center government now in place. It was in 2018, in 2019, in 2018, with the crisis, and 2019 they reimpose capital controls. So it does happen. Again, the adjustment in all of the international monetary sort of stories, in my view, the actual functioning was asymmetric. So countries in the periphery always had, being forced to introduce wedges in the functioning of the system. So I think that will continue to happen. If you're asking on a general basis, I don't see that, there's a whole discussion of whether the IMF and how much the IMF has changed views. I tend to be skeptical. I think that the IMF has produced things in which they suggest that under certain circumstances, so they moved from the 90s view that liberalization was great, which was never officially implemented. But I think that they still believe, very much as I said, for the conventional view, that capital controls overall are capital movement, and it's at the end of the day a good thing. It allows the allocation of resources in an efficient way, and so I don't think that there is any sort of interest also in Wall Street to move in that direction, or in the financial capitals in Europe, and so in Frankfurt. So I don't see that as necessarily something that it's in the cards for the global international system.
There's too much agreement by the two presenters here. My period of writing about sand in the wheels of international finance was the 1990s. One of my proud achievements was to write a piece in the Economic Journal with Charles Wieplos and with my dissertation advisor, Jim Tobin, about the case for sand in the wheels. I now think, for better or for worse, 25 years later, that the world has moved on, and that both because of the further development of financial markets and because of the political leverage of financial markets and institutions, there's zero probability of this happening in the OECD world. There are likely to be significant additional moves by the Argentinas and the Ugandas and so forth of the world. What about the emerging markets between those two extremes, if you will? I'm not sure, but I think the obstacles to any kind of international agreement on this, the prospects of a major emerging market like Brazil tightening controls, strike me as remote.
Okay, so no hope. Okay, I think we have finished. Maybe Louis-Philippe would like to say something to conclude the conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this incredibly interesting meeting, and thank you for inviting me, and please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, all those who participated, to Lilia for hosting, and to our guest speakers today, Barry Eichengreen and Matthias Vernengo. It was a pleasure. It was a great seminar, and I want to remind everyone that Matthias's and Barry's papers will appear in the October issue of the Review of Political Economy, and I will be, I'm sure, promoting both papers heavily on Twitter and other social media. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.